program through, really. They were also the last ones to issue the passports themselves because of security concerns, but, you know, who are we to judge? So I had a look, before the PKD was available, I was looking at, you know, how difficult would it be to forge a certificate, and actually obviously not very. That's a New Zealand certificate taken out of a passport, and that's my copy of it. So if I flick between the two, you can see the only thing changing is the cryptographic modulus and the signature below and so on. So if you don't have a PKD, it's utterly trivial to produce a realistic looking certificate and sign with it. So other threats, again, one of the defences that came out early on, at least in the UK, was that, yeah, so what? You've read the data off a passport, but you already had the passport in your hand. What's the big deal? So I was actually challenged by a national newspaper to try and read a passport that I couldn't see the internal page. So they had someone apply for a passport, and then I went to their offices, and the person with the passport came to the office, and we had a sealed envelope, and I was able to find out the key data I needed and get into that passport within about 4 hours, because there is no brute force protection. I can try as often as I like to log in, it's just going to keep letting me do it. So if I can show you that. If I change, say, the last 2 digits of the passport number, so what I've done is just put 2 question marks there because I don't know those 2 digits, yeah? So it's going to try and log in, it's going to fail, it's going to try and log in, it's going to fail, and it'll keep doing that for a bit until eventually it gets in. So there is no anti-brute force mechanism, unlike a credit card, 3 strikes and you're out. Mobile phone, GIM's GSM card will lock you out if you get it wrong too often. Passport, I did 40,000 attempts to get into this passport, and I was in, so not a problem. However, that isn't really feasible unless you know a hell of a lot of the key space. It's just way too slow. So the problem here is not that it's I knocked the passport, but as you saw, it did manage to log in. But so I got an OK authentication just before I whacked it with my wrist. So the problem is that the key space isn't strong enough. We can derive the key information from other sources. We can find out people's dates of birth. We can find out the passport number by doing analysis on the way passports are issued, and you can find out the expiry date of the passport if it's in transit from some clues on the envelope. I think a Dutch company called Riskier did an analysis of the Dutch system and worked out that they could brute force pretty much any arbitrary passport within about 4 hours on a standard PC, or 2 hours I think they got it down to, because their key space is so easily reduced. The other issue is profiling passports. So you can tell which country a passport came from, even if you can't read the actual data. So in a lot of cases, you can say, well, I don't know who this guy is, but he's American, or he's Australian, or he's Italian, or whatever. So there's an obvious threat there. And the reason you can do that is because each country has implemented the standard slightly differently. And instead of enforcing a rigid standard, they've allowed it to creep, and so there's a lot of different ways you can do it and still be within the standard. So every time someone does something different, the combination of differences tells you who they are. So again, you could build a bomb that only goes off when an Australian or an American or an Italian goes by, which I kind of think would be bad. So as I mentioned, the tools that I've used, all open source. It's written in Python. It's hardware independent, so I have an abstraction layer that talks to the actual reader device. I currently support ACG, Frosh, and PCSC devices using PCSC Lite. There's a project called OpenPCD, which is a completely open circuit design for an RFID reader. And we're currently working on that. They're actually going to make the low-level interface compatible with my slightly higher-level interface, so you can use RF Idiot to talk to it. It's all freely downloadable from there. I have a few devices with me, if anyone's interested, that I can show you, or if you want to acquire one, and I also sell them on the site. So, any questions on the high frequency stuff? Yes, sir. Is my passport discussion in a white paper on the website? It's not, but it's about to be. Just before I came out, I wrote an article for a security magazine which covers most of what I've talked about here in brief. And what I'll probably do after that's published is expand on that. No other questions? Yes? Shielding. Yeah, different country. The question was, is there any shielding to protect the passport from unauthorized reading? Most passports have no shielding at all. The US passport has shielding in the cover, but it's such that if you drop the passport like this and it pops open slightly, it's actually acting as an amplifier. So it actually makes it easier to read from a greater distance. Yes, sir. I'm sorry, will it support? Will the OpenPCD project passport low-end tags or just the OpenPCD project, question was, which tags does it support? It's specifically the 1356 megahertz frequency tags. It's aimed at the ISO standard 14443A passports, MyFair, so on. Yes, sir. So there are smart chips that have both the RFID interface and the standard content interface. Yeah. The question was, have I tested against smart chips that have the standard chip interface as well as the RFID interface? Basically, if you take a smart card and you remove the physical contacts and put an RFID system and an antenna instead, everything behind is the same. You're talking to a smart card. When I read a passport, I'm using smart card standard commands to say, select this application, select this file, read the blocks off the file, and so on. So I think generally those devices will just have a dual path to the underlying chip. You could attack them from either way. Now I've implemented PCSC, the PC Smart Card standard. I am going to start looking at chips as well. So there's some interesting applications like chip and pin in the UK. An issue that often comes up for me, actually, is in the UK we use the chips. We don't use the mag stripes anymore. And so what happens is I don't notice when my mag stripe gets FUBAR'd. So I go abroad to somewhere where you don't use mag stripes, and my cash card doesn't work because the mag stripe's screwed, and I've never noticed because in UK we use the chip. There is a file on that chip which is an image of the mag stripe. So in theory I could read it off and re-blow my mag stripe for myself, which I have the tools, So I'm going to play with that because it would be handy. Yes, sir. On the last slide, you said that the Australian passport didn't allow file read, but allowed select. Can you just talk about that for a second? Okay, so the question was about the way the Australian passport behaves. The standard says that you can you do basic auth at the point where the passport decides it wants to authorize you. So you connect to the passport. You select a unique application ID. The way smart cards work is every manufacturer has their own ID, or every program has its own ID. So the passport application is a unique ID that you select. So you say, select the passport application. If it's a passport, it will say OK. So you've already identified the fact you're talking to a passport and not a credit card or something else. You then say, select the master file. On a British passport, as soon as you said select the master file, it would say authenticate. On the Australian passport, it'll say OK. You then say read the master file. The Australian passport will say authenticate. On the British passport, you already authenticated. So it's just a difference in when it does things. And both of those approaches are legal according to the standard, so it'll just work. They haven't done anything wrong. Yeah. Yes, sir? Right. I just wonder what kind of trouble would that cause if I use that near an airport. Okay, so would a ham radio broadcasting on 1356 megahertz cause a problem with the reader? It probably depends how much you're squirting through, but as I said at the beginning, I'm not a low-level guy. I would say there's other people here who understand the radio and the electronics much better. The 1356 tags actually do have a defense against that. They have anti-collision built into the standard. The lower stuff, the 125s, tend not to. So a certain three-letter manufacturer's reader, for example, who shall remain nameless, if you were to take one of their tags and break out the chip and glue it to the bottom of the reader at a 90-degree angle, say, you might just feel like doing that. It's possible that future tags wouldn't be able to read anymore because it's blocking the signal. It's just sending out a permanent signal to the reader, and the new tags will. So you can DOS a building with a 1 pound tag. And that probably applies to all the other standards as well. There's no anti-collision, so if you have 2 tags in the field, they won't read. But on the high frequency, you can have 2 tags in the field and they will read. Yes, sir? The paper-based, the cheapo paper-based ones are underneath the same format. The circuitry is very, very simple. It's just an antenna and a little chip embedded in it. So you see them all over the place. I mean, in fact, I think Gap now, any clothes you buy will have a little bit of cloth in which has an RFID tag built into it. Yes, sir? Have I looked at the debit cards? I've seen the new Amex, and it follows the ISO 14443A standard. So I can read it. I have a device that will clone the ID. Actually, I can show you that. This is a commercial piece of test equipment. It's actually designed for testing readers. So it's a smart card emulator. And what it is the circuitry for doing the RFID plus an FPGA. So you program the FPGA to provide the smart card application or whatever else you want to do. And it will, in its default state, it will just spit out an ID and nothing else. So if those micropayments are being based on purely the unique ID, then they use the new technology that's capable of doing all the crypto and everything in the dumb card way. Ironically, a certain 3-letter manufacturer who shall remain nameless has got a new standard system which is using an ISO standard, so they can't throw patent attorneys at you if you do stuff because it's a standard. And their new ones some of them are susceptible to that kind of cloning attack as well because they haven't used the crypto functions on the cards. So a step backwards, I think. Yes, sir? Does the industry understand the implications of this? That's always a hard one to say. I mean, the reason I believe in full disclosure, because what the industry understands and what the industry does are usually 2 completely separate things. And full disclosure is a helpful tool in enabling them to better understand why they should behave differently and make changes. I mean, it's obvious that the manufacturers of the tags like the Q5 and the high tag, they must know that you can program any ID you want into that tag. So on the one hand, they're telling consumers these tags are super secure and cannot be cloned, and on the other hand, they're telling